This is Chapter 18 of Hattie Big Sky by Kirby Larson. July 1918. The Arlington News. Honyaker's Homily, Independence Day. Don't think because we have no fancy bandstands or city parks that we can't celebrate Independence Day with as much verve as you do in the big city. Folks from all around will gather on the banks of Wolf Creek to picnic, play baseball, and commiserate about the dreadfully dry weather. Though the tone will be light, we will stop at noon to honor our servicemen, and each of us, this writer especially, will pray that the current Allied success at the Battle of Cantigny signals a speedy end to this war. And there'll be vanilla ice cream. Chase had gone on for a full 5 minutes about the upcoming 4th of July picnic. Oh, and the baseball game. It sounds wonderful. I filled another kettle with water from my well and lugged it over to the struggling garden. Thank the Lord for the deep well Uncle Chester had dug. After carrying countless kettlefuls to the green beans that morning, my arms felt as if they would fall right out of my shoulder sockets. Chase filled a smaller pot and carefully measured the water out over my sunflower. Mama did this last year, he said, planted flowers in coffee cans. She said this year she planted a baby instead. We both laughed. As we carried water to my onions and beets and melons and carrots, I thought back to all the gallons of water I'd wasted in my life. Not here. Every drop was put to good use. Even my Saturday night bath water was stretched out, first washing me, then washing the cabin floor, and then washing the dust off the tiny flower garden by the front steps. I stood and tried to stretch the kinks out of my aching back. Oof! Carl says it's 32 days without rain. Mr. Nevsker says it's 31. Chase dipped his hand in the pot, wetted his fingers, and sprinkled his red face with a few drops of water. I think Carl's right. I'd bet on Carl, too. I tousled Chase's hair. If I was the gambling kind. With Chase's help, my chores were soon done. I sent him home. We'll be by for you tomorrow, early, he called over his shoulder. I bustled myself inside, and soon there were 4 choke cherry pies cooling on the kitchen table. If it were possible to cool in this blamed heat. I'd taken to sleeping on my mattress out in the front of the cabin in the last week. There wasn't a breath of air inside at night, even with the door open. The first night I'd slept outside, there was a lot of outside and not much sleeping. It's amazing what you can hear when you're stretched out on the prairie grass. Once the chickens settled, the night birds got to talking. Then there was the rustling grass all night long. I could only wish that rustle was caused by a breeze. But the air was thick as corn syrup. No, these rustles belonged to the prairie night. Pack rats and prairie dogs and who knew what else. Paralee had seen a skunk not long back. The only animal I didn't much worry about was Violet's wolf. There'd been no sign of it since that one winter's day. Bounty hunters no doubt had dispatched it, as they had most of the wolves in this part of the country. The second night I dragged my mattress outside, I was done in from lack of sleep, the heat, and pulling weeds all day. Sleep snatched me up as fast as the hawk I'd seen snatch up a field mouse that day. Though the mattress did little to smooth out the lumps on the ground, it was better than sleeping inside that oven of a house. Independence Day morning, Mr. Whiskers tickled me awake with a lick of his sandpaper tongue. I patted him, then stretched. Ouch! Every night I'd slept out, I'd found some new crick in my neck or back the next morning. I bent stiffly to pick up my mattress, took it back inside, and got myself organized for the day at Wolf Creek. In with the pies and the blanket and the fan from the National War Savings Day Parade was something that would no doubt surprise everyone at the picnic. When I was ready, I added to the letter I'd started to Charlie. Here, Leafy and I were worried about Lottie at first, being so small, but that child is now solid as a tin of lard. I wondered if the other children might have their noses out of joint a bit about the baby, but they all adore her. Maddie nearly mothers her to death. She got it into her head to make Lottie a quilt, a sister quilt, so I am helping her. The stitches are uneven but full of love. The jingle of harnesses made me set aside the letter, grab my hat, and take one last look around. If I'd forgotten anything, it would have to stay forgotten. I hefted my basket of goodies and stepped out to greet the Muellers. "Don't you look the picture," said Paralee. I smiled, noting with approval that there were some cherries in her cheeks. She'd been slow coming back from giving birth to Lottie. "A picture of a cooked goose, you mean?" I climbed up next to her and began to fan myself. "Do you think we'll ever get a breath of breeze again?" "It'll be cool by the creek," she promised. "Nice and cool." We rode along in companionable silence. It was too hot even to visit. "Hello there!" Rooster Jim helped the children out of the wagon when we reached the picnic grounds. Maddie ran straight to Leafy to show off Muley's new sunbonnet. Chase helped Carl settle the horses, then took off with Elmer Jr. and some of the boys from the Lutheran church to bob for critters at the creek. "Saved you a spot in the shade." Leafy waved us over. We set out blankets and an apple box for Lottie's bed. I served up sweet tea, and we chatted with some of the women from church. "Is this everyone?" I asked. "Nevskers will be out after they close up the store at noon." Leafy rolled her cool glass against her forehead. "They never miss a baseball game, not even Bub." I smiled into my iced tea glass. "Wait till they saw what Arlington, Iowa had to offer." "Grace and Wayne will be along too," she continued, ticking our neighbors off on her fingers. "The Martins rarely come." That would suit me fine. True to Leafy's prediction, the Nevskers arrived in the early afternoon. "Ready to play?" Bub called as he drove up in his wagon. Though there were some good-natured grumbles about the heat, soon enough a field was laid out and players divvied themselves up. It had been a long time since I'd been on a baseball field. Though none of my neighbors knew it, baseball was something I could do. And do well, thanks to Charlie's patient instruction. I reached into my basket and brought out my surprise. "Can anyone play?" I asked, slipping my baseball mitt on my right hand. "What's this?" Gust Trischelt spat juicily in my direction. He'd grumbled a bit earlier about the German folks from the Lutheran church playing. When Wayne pointed out that the name Trischelt sounded German, Gust shook his head. "It's Swiss," he said. "Swiss." I figured he'd fume more about me playing than the Lutherans. "A willing player," I told him. Gust hooted at that. "'Spect you'd better play then." He thumbed toward young Paul Schillinger on the other team. I nodded and went to join Paul's team. We would have first ups. Hitting was not my strength, but I managed a serviceable single after Paul's own single. Henry Henshaw hit Paul in with a powerful double. Then Chase came up to bat. "Bunt!" I hollered. Even in this heat, I was pretty sure I could beat out a bunt and make it home. But boys will be boys. With 2 outs, Chase swung for heaven 3 times. "You're out," called Reverend Tweed. Chase dropped his bat dejectedly. I almost had it, he said. Reverend Tweed patted him on the shoulder. Better luck next time, he said. Now, get on out in the field with your team. Chase took his position in left field. We put all the young ones in the field, figuring they had the energy to actually run after any ball that might find its way out there. Paul took the ball and headed for the pitcher's mound. The first batter he faced was Wayne Robbins. See if you can hit this, boasted Paul. Wayne had a good eye. He connected sweetly and sent the ball sailing. So did the next 5 batters. None away, called Reverend Tweed as yet another batter came to the plate. Scores 5-1. Hey, Paul, I called out from third base. Come here. Paul looked puzzled, but came over to see what I had to say. I wish I'd had a camera to capture the expression on his face when I suggested we trade spots. But I always pitch, he said. I pointed to the loaded bases. This well? He shook his head but handed me the ball. I hurried out to the pitcher's mound. Now wait a minute, called Gust. Mow him down, Hattie, Leafy hollered. Reverend Tweed wiped his face. Play ball! Charlie would have been so tickled to see me strike out the first 2 batters. 6 pitches was all it took. Then Wayne stepped up to bat again. Show me your best stuff, he called. It's so fast you won't even be able to see it. Bragging wasn't ladylike, but it was part of the fun of baseball. Fast for a girl, maybe, he egged. That did it. He was getting a snake ball. I wound up and delivered. The ball spun toward the plate, and Wayne smacked it a good one. It soared over my head and far out into the field. The runners emptied the bases, and the game was over. We'd been royally beaten. I'm sorry, Paul. I handed the ball back to our captain. It's only a game, he said. Then he winked. I'll bet you'll get him next time. We shook on it. Next time, I said. Ice cream's ready, Paul Schillinger announced. It was just the thing atop a slice of my choke cherry pie, even if I do say so myself. We visited and ate. Paralee and I walked down by the creek, shedding shoes and stockings to cool our feet. We filled our lunch baskets with wild plums from a tree at the creek bank, then rejoined the others and visited some more. Pa Schillinger was the first to pack up. Evening chores, he explained. We best be going too, said Paralee. I helped her carry the picnic things and tired, dirty children to the wagon. Maddie screeched when Paralee tried to set her in the back of the wagon. I want to sit with Hattie. Okay, sweetie. I took her from her mother and we settled on the wagon seat. Within a few minutes, she was sound asleep, her little body a hot water bottle on my lap. The front of my dress was drenched in perspiration. As we neared the trail to my place, I eased Maddie onto Paralee's lap. Drop me here, I told Carl. I'll cool off as I walk. I kissed the top of Maddie's head, fetched my basket from the back, and strolled the rest of the way home. My dress front was nearly dry by the time my house came into view. I sat on the front step, drinking in the sweet scent of the wild plums in the basket on my lap, first enjoying the memory of the lovely day, and then thinking about how to end this month's Honyaker's homily. The sound of riders nudged me out of my reverie. Cowboys often rode my way, chasing down the odd-tipped cow or two. These riders, 3 of them, appeared to be headed east toward the Martins. One rider broke off from the others. He turned his horse, a very large horse, my way. Evening, Hattie. I could smell whiskey from where I stood. You have a nice time at the picnic? I did, Mr. Martin. I stood up and turned to go in. There'd be no sleeping out tonight. Hot, isn't it? He flicked the end of the reins at a mosquito, even worse than last summer. Yes, it is hot. Surely he hadn't ridden over simply to discuss the weather. Of course, last year we had the grasshoppers too. Traft shifted in the saddle. 1 minute the sky was as clear as Wolf Creek. He paused to look up, studying the twilight sky. Next, it was dark as night and thick with grasshoppers. I shivered. Gorley's wheat was gone in minutes. Traft shook his head in an exaggerated display of sympathy. Robin's, too. The flax was next. They didn't have enough of a crop left to cover seed money. He snorted a rough laugh. Of course, it wasn't only crops they got. I left my good jacket hanging on the fence post. Danged if those hoppers didn't munch their way through that, too. What is your point, Mr. Martin? There was a point, of course, and tingles down my spine made me certain it wasn't a good point. Trying to get your attention, he said. He slipped off his horse. That's all. Crackling prairie noises carried softly on the air. I strained my ears over them to listen for the clicking of grasshopper legs and wings. Well, you have it. He took a few steps toward me. This is a hard life, he said in a gentler voice. I had to laugh. Stop the presses. Hattie, he paused for a moment. We got off on the wrong foot somehow. Wrong foot? The levity was short-lived. You call setting a man's barn on fire the wrong foot? Leading a mob against Mr. Ebgerd the wrong foot? I slapped my palms against my skirt in anger. He reached me in one stride, grabbed my arm, and shook it so hard plums went flying from my basket. I want you to listen to me, to finish what I started to say once. Was I getting used to his bullying ways? My legs didn't wobble one bit. I eyed his hand, and he turned me loose. I didn't set the fire at Carl's. By the time I heard about it, it was too late to stop them. And don't ask me who it was. He turned his hands up in a gesture of surrender. But I was able to drag the burning bundle away from your barn before it went too. What? He'd been trying to save my barn, not burn it? And that thing with Ebgerd, it did get out of hand, I admit. He shook his head, then cursed. There's laws that say we got to support this country, this war. And when folks like Ebgerd dodge their duty... You have a nerve, I snapped. Dodging his duty? What about yours? There you stand, safe and sound, while people like Elmer and I couldn't even mention Charlie's name to this man. Countless others go off to fight. Traft reacted as if I'd whipped him. You're right. That's what they all think, that I'm shirking my real duty. He rubbed his forehead. I didn't wait to get drafted like some. I enlisted. Then why are you still here? Same thing I wondered a dozen times over. He reached down and picked up one of the wild plums he'd jarred from my basket. Then I found out. Mother finagled the governor to appoint me to the Council of Defense. The draft board said that could be my service. He rolled the plum in his hand, then cocked back his arm and fired the fruit off into the night. The look on Traft's face was all too familiar. I'd seen it on my own face countless times while I lived with Aunt Ivy. I felt as if the final piece of a crazy quilt had just been stitched in place. This was one angry man. Angry at his mother, yes, but no doubt angrier at himself for letting someone else run his life. A thought presented itself to me, an understanding thought. Traft and I had that in common. Before coming out here, I hadn't much say in my own life either. I couldn't help myself. In that moment, I granted Traft forgiveness for the ugly actions his bitterness had led him to. I am sorry, I said, for your troubles. Do this unto the least of these, the Bible taught. I could almost feel the star being added to my heavenly crown for this gesture. He turned to face me. You see, then, why I need your land. What? My crown slipped. No, I mean, I'm sorry for your troubles, but that doesn't mean... Is it that fellow you write all them letters to? Traft's eyes bored into me. Are you working the place for him? Charlie? This conversation zigged and zagged like the rick-rack on Maddie's dress. Traft, I do thank you for saving my barn, and for attempting to save Carl's, but this conversation is over. You won't sell? It was dark enough now that I couldn't see his face clearly, but the tone of his voice oozed barely controlled anger. For some reason, Aunt Ivy's voice came to me at that moment. A proper young woman turns down at least 2 proposals before accepting one, she'd told me once. She'd been speaking of marriage proposals, of course, but I decided to take her advice anyway. No, I said, turning down his offer to buy my land for a second time. Good night, Traft. I strode up my 2 rickety steps with as much pride as I could summon. I turned as I opened the door, but he was already astride Trouble, wheeling the big horse around. They thundered out of my yard. That wasn't the only thunder I heard that night. The skies opened up and rain, glorious rain, quenched the dust-dry prairie. Listening to the patter on my roof, I sat myself down and wrote the conclusion to my July Honyaker's homily. My uncle's hero is Abraham Lincoln, surely the symbol of independence. One of the stories I love best about Lincoln is that after his election to office, he appointed some of his bitterest enemies to his cabinet. It seems then, as now, the greatest freedom is found in forgiveness. Let us embrace that element of liberty as we forgive our enemies as we forgive ourselves. June 15, 1918, somewhere in France. Dear Hattie, I've thought of you often lately. How you used to make me laugh, how you used to wind up like a windmill before you threw a ball, how you used to blow at the hair falling across your forehead. A fellow needs to think of pleasant things like that. I came here thinking I was going to win this war and come on home in no time at all. Now I think I'll never leave this mud and cold and misery. I know you expect your old pal to be full of humor, but my best buddy died this morning. I was not 20 yards from him. In all the training, they never told us about the smell of death. For the first time, I was not so confident of coming home. Not so confident of anything. I always bragged about killing some Germans. Killing is nothing to brag about. Nothing at all. Yours, Charlie.